Good morning, everyone. It is just about 5 o'clock in the morning on September 4th, 2019, and we are continuing our test, our comparison between the iFi Micro iDSD Black Label. Oh boy, what a word, what a way to describe this thing, huh? Versus the Chord Mojo. And we have done the soundstage and power test comparison. We did the bass comparison, bass test, and now we're doing the mids. Now, before we get started, I want to go back to the iFi website and emphasize once again that they're honing in on a very particular sound signature. They say it's warmer and smoother. Warmer and smoother than what? I don't know. They don't really say what you should compare this to. I assume you should compare it to anything else that you have other than another iFi and other than a Mojo. Because so far I can say that the differences between the iFi Black Label and the Mojo are few and far between. I had a subscriber yesterday ask me, well, does one or the other have better soundstage? Because people on HeadFi and other forums were saying that the iFi has better soundstage, and the answer is no. The soundstage is fundamentally the same between these two. There's no significant difference, if any, and certainly none that I have been able to find in my testing. So that out of the way, here's what we're going to do. We are going to test the mids on 3 songs. Want You Back by Haim, Heartbreak by Chris Serro, Why Am I by Orla Gartland, and we're also going to test the 3D effect on the iFi. And that the Mojo doesn't have a 3D effect, so we're not going to bother with it, obviously, because we can't. But I do want to know very briefly whether or not the 3D effect is of some benefit or not. Because as you know, in the past, whenever a device has had a 3D effect sort of switch, it has always destroyed the song. It has just taken everything that was good about the song and stretched it out and made it a much more lean presentation, which is not really what it's advertised to do. It's supposed to open up the sound signature, and 3D effect doesn't. So let's see if the iFi is able to defeat that prior failure and be victorious. Let's get started. We are starting with Want You Back on my test playlist. I have an AB switch. Both units are plugged into USB 3.0. Currently, I have the iFi at the screen below. At the bottom of the screen, you will see a playhead, and you will also see timed markers where you can skip back and forth to whichever portion you want to go to. A is going to be iFi, B is the Mojo. So let's start with the iFi. Here we go. No sibilance. Volume is at about 10 o'clock, which is a very comfortable listening volume. Around the house, I wouldn't listen to this song any louder because it drowns out most of what's outside, but I could still hear my voice as I'm talking to you right now. Her voice sounds very smooth. With the backup vocalists, I could hear their separate tonality, but not as well as I've heard it on much more analytical devices like, say, the Cobalt THX players and amplifiers. So what's happening is I hear the primary vocalist very clearly, very smooth, undistorted, and the backup vocalists are somewhere in a foggy haze in the background. I hear one of them in the right ear cup, and I hear the other one barely in the left ear cup. There are separate tonalities, but they're just so muted from, I think, 45 seconds to about 1 minute and 10 seconds of the song that it's really difficult to hear them. When they are emphasized in the song, where, like in this part, you can clearly hear their separate tonalities. Left and right ear cups have the different vocalists, and you can tell that they have very different voices. When everybody is singing together right now, all three, I can hear the primary vocalist clearly. the backup vocalist voices meld together, and it makes it a little bit more difficult to separate their tonalities. It's not impossible, because there is in fact a slight difference in the left ear cup versus the right ear cup, and if you pay attention you can definitely pick that out, but it is not presented to you immediately. Instead, what happens, you have to really pay attention for that separation. Okay, so now let us switch to the Mojo, and let's find out if the Mojo is able to present it in the same way or if it does something different. Here we go. Volume is at double orangish yellow. Now it's double yellow, and now it's double green, which is about the same as what I had on the iFi. So far, I can't hear any tonality difference between the two devices. Clean, clear, undistorted, but warm sound signature. The only difference I would say, and this might just be very minor, is that the guitar has a longer and more emphasized reverberation on the Mojo than on the iFi, but it's not huge, because it only, the guitar is only playing intermittently, and when it is part of the mix, it's so quiet in the mix it doesn't really do anything to interfere with the vocals. The primary vocalist is about the same, if not exactly the same, as on the iFi. I hear no soundstage difference. I hear no distortion in her voice, no harshness. Is it as smooth as the iFi? Yeah, probably. With the backup vocalist singing right now, it sounds pretty much the same as it did on the iFi, left and right separation. And now when they're all singing together, it's harder to find the difference in the vocal separation in the backup vocalist on the Mojo than it was on the iFi. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go back to about 1 minute and 58 seconds when the backup vocalists are saying, just know that I want you back. The primary vocalist is singing that, and the two backup vocalists are singing that. What should happen, I think, is that you should hear their different tonalities, all three. The primary is not an issue because she's dead center in the mix and ahead of everything else. But the two backup vocalists should, left and right ear cup, have different tonalities. You should be able to pick them out. Now, because these two units have a warmer presentation, they also try to end up blending the two voices together, the backup vocalists together. I thought I heard the iFi separate the voices better than the Mojo. So let's go back to 1 minute and 58 seconds. I'm going to listen on the Mojo, go back, switch to the iFi, listen on the iFi. Here we go. Yeah, there is, in fact, a very slight difference between the Mojo and the iFi. This portion of the song at around 1 minute and 58 seconds, when I'm using that as kind of like the test, the 1 minute and 58 seconds, when all three are singing and you have the backup vocalist coming in saying, want you back, just know that I want you back. And there in the background, you can hear a little bit more air and a little bit more separation between the two. So there's a distinctly different tonality in the left ear cup versus the right ear cup. And what the Mojo did is that it blended the tonality, and it just sounded like one voice in the left, one voice in the right, but they're pretty much the same. And it's not a ginormous difference, right? I mean, the separation is on the iFi is present. It's just not so clear and crystal clear that you might say, oh my God, this is a world different. It's not like that. However, the presentation is noticeable if you do an A and B test. The Mojo blends it far too much together, where the iFi is able to just present it a little bit more open and a little bit more separated than the Mojo. Okay, so now let us go to Heartbreak by Chris Serra. I already have the iFi plugged in, so that's what we're going to stick with. Here we go. Now, this song is a little different from Want You Back, because Heartbreak has always presented itself as a instrument heavy and instrument emphasized song, and the vocals take a back seat. So at the middle of the song, what happens is all the instruments are playing and they overpower the vocalist. And so it sounds almost like on a sound stage, the instruments are dead center and the vocalists are 3 steps behind the instruments and trying to sing as loudly as they can so that you can try to hear them through the mix. That's always how it's been presented. And so far, clean, clear, smooth, and that's exactly the presentation where the mix is ahead, the instruments are ahead of the vocals. No distortion though. When the bass comes in, the drum, it's very fast, doesn't interfere with the vocals. And now with the mix playing all of it, all the instruments, the vocals, the vocals sound 2 or 3 steps behind the mix. You can still hear them, but it's not particularly easy to figure out what they're saying. They get drowned out by the mix. Okay. So the reason I think that this is a good song to test is because there's a bass line. Like, I know that this song really doesn't favor the vocals. The vocals are mixed in the background, essentially. And if either of these two units, the iFi or the Mojo, has a mid-centric emphasis for the vocals, it should appear that way. I should be able to tell the difference. And so right now, the iFi has presented this song as I've always heard it, with a, unless it was a very mid-forward headphone, I've always heard it in this manner. Now let us switch to the Mojo and figure out if it does the same thing. Okay, we're on the Mojo and let's go. By the way, I haven't changed the volume. I've left the volume double green and at about 10:30 on the iFi. Sounds pretty much the same so far. Clean, clear, smooth. The vocal separation early on in the song appears to be exactly the same. So at this point, you can tell there are multiple vocalists. Sounded the same to me on the iFi. With that bass, I could say that the Mojo has a bumped up bass and it's more emphasized. It's still not overpowering the vocals, but it's more present. There's a bit more impact behind it than on the Mojo, on the iFi, excuse me. Now, the entire mix is playing. I would say that the vocals sound pretty much the same as they did on the iFi, but not as clear as on the iFi. So here's the thing. On the iFi, with everything playing, the instruments and the vocals, even though they were overpowered by the mix, as they were intended to in the song, they were still audible. Like, I could hear it. It was difficult, but I could hear what they were saying. Whereas the Mojo, it's not possible for me to understand what they are saying. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to go back to about 1 minute and 22 seconds or so and play for about 5 seconds. Listen to the Mojo, go back, listen to it on the iFi. Here we go. Yeah, there's better separation on the iFi than on the Mojo, on the song when everything is playing. So even though that they both present the sound stage the same, right? The instruments are ahead, the vocalists are several steps behind the instruments. It's harder to hear them. That's all true between these two. But the difference between the iFi and the Mojo is that the iFi simply allows me to hear the vocalists, whereas the Mojo really distorts it to a unpleasant extent. And by distortion, I mean you can't hear them. Because of the way that the instruments are presented, because of that boosted bass, the vocals get lost and it becomes so muddy that it's very, very difficult for me to understand what these vocalists are saying. The iFi has a slightly bit more air in the mids, and I can hear the separation a little bit better, and I can hear the words when I listen for it. I listen for the words on the Mojo, and I still can't easily hear them. Now, is it a night and day difference? No, I wouldn't say it's a night and day difference. It's not the type of difference that was between the Mojo and the Cobalt, but it is noticeable on an A and B test. And if you're looking to find one of these two units in order to listen to the music, to the vocal, even through a mix like this, then I think that the iFi would be the better choice. Okay, so now let us go to Why Am I Like This by Orla Gartland. And I think I have the black label plugged in, and let's go with that. Now, Why Am I Like This is pretty much an acoustic song with an acoustic guitar as backup. Very clean, clear sound signature. No gratiness, no harshness. It's a very smooth presentation, because sometimes what happens with acoustic singers, especially female acoustic singers, is that they can become sibilant very quickly. They can become a little harsh in their voice. She controls her voice very well, and on top of that, there is a smoothness the iFi imparts that doesn't lie, right? So it doesn't destroy the song. It doesn't change the tonality in her voice. It just smooths it out just a little bit. Okay, so now let's switch to the Mojo. And let's start. I can tell immediately that the acoustic guitar has a stronger presence on the Mojo than it did on the iFi. It lingers a little bit longer. It sounds more emphasized. There's a slight bit of sibilance in her voice on the Mojo. Very, very tiny. Her voice sounds a little grainy. So let me stop. And let's go back to about 34 seconds. Let's play this again. Yeah. maybe you, around 35 seconds when she's saying maybe you, there's this harshness, this graininess. This almost sounds grating to the ears. It's just, it's not pleasant, and it's not something that I heard on the iPhone. I'm going to switch in a moment to the iFi and listen for it, but I want to give this enough time to test. Let's go back to about 25 seconds and listen for 10 seconds on the Mojo. Go back to 25 and listen on the iFi. Here we go. Okay. Switching to the iFi. Okay, so here's what's going on. That graininess that I hear, here's how it's presented on the iFi. The iFi just presents it as a treble frequency. So it's not ear piercing, it's not harsh in any way. It's just that it's that energy up there when she's singing. And the Mojo, for some strange reason, makes it sound gravelly. It's not, it's not like real gravel. It doesn't sound distorted or distracting, but it does, what it does is it changes the treble to a graininess, and I don't understand why it would do that. And so when I listen to it on the iFi, what I hear is that energy in the upper region. It's not sibilant, it's not ear piercing, it's merely just the S sounds as she's singing. The Mojo takes those S sounds and adds a bit of noise, adds a bit of graininess, and it's a clearly different presentation to me between these two. Does it take away from the song? No, I don't think it really takes away from the song, but it's not presenting the song the same way as the iFi. Once again, just like with everything else we've said, it's not a huge difference, night and day, but it is noticeable when you do an A and B. We also know for a fact, however, by the way, that the Mojo does add distortion, graininess, noise, whatever you want to call it. The more volume you put into it, that's not just me talking about that. That's multiple users who have commented about that. Okay, so now we are done with this. Let's instead now go to the 3D effect on the iFi. And I'm going to use Flight from the City as my test for the 3D effect, because it's a piano-centric song and I want to find out if it adds air to the song or if it just kind of stretches the frequency out and it makes it thin. Here we go. Okay, I'm going to turn on 3D effect now. It's a very subtle change. .3D effect off. Interesting. So here's the thing. It does change it, and it changes it just slightly. And all it does is it adds a little bit of air, just a tiny bit, so that you can tell that there's a difference. The piano still sounds warm and natural, undistorted. Okay, so now let's go. I'm going to switch 3D effect off. And let's go back to Heartbreak. Or actually, I'm sorry, Want You Back. Volume is at about 1030. 11. Turn on 3D now. Very subtle change. I can't even really tell the difference in this song. Yeah, when I keep doing the 3D switch on and off, when I keep switching it off and on, I hear a very, very tiny difference, which is consistent with what I heard on the previous song, Fly from the City. And the difference tends to be that with the 3D effect on, the bass emphasis is reduced slightly, and the mid seem to be just a tiny bit increased, just a little bit, and the treble seems to be just a little bit increased. So what it does, it reduces the bass, and I think it certainly adds a little bit to the treble, just a tiny, tiny bit, and I think it adds just a tiny bit to the mids, and that gives you that a little bit more open presentation. It's done so tactfully that it's not in your face, and you may not notice it on every song, but if you keep switching it on and off quickly, and you keep listening to the song, you will probably very likely hear some sort of a difference. And I am not offended by it at all. Like, there have been other 3D effects that we've listened to where I say, this is awful, I would never use a 3D effect. I would never use Dirac Surround, for example, on the THX from Monolith. That is just total nonsense. And there have been other units that have this 3D effect sort of thing. You know, Fio has it, and it doesn't do anything. It stretches out the frequency. It's like watering down wine. And watered down wine doesn't taste all that good. But what the Mojo does is that it doesn't thin out the mix. It just reduces it just a little tiny bit, reduces the bass frequency a little bit. And it increased just a tiny bit in the treble. At least that's the way that it's being presented. And it's done in such a way that it doesn't destroy the song. It doesn't sound like it's thinning out the frequency at all. It just adds a tiny bit of air. And I'm okay with that. It sounds good. Now, would I use the 3D effect? I can't really see myself using the 3D effect. I would get a much better presentation by just switching headphones or EQing inside your, either the player that you have or on your computer. But if you just want a slight difference, you want to hear if there's a tonality change, or if there's a way you can add a little bit of air, you're just looking for a finesse switch, then I would say that 3D switch is in fact the finesse switch. So overall, not bad. I am fairly happy with the way that iFi has implemented the 3D switch in this unit. Okay, so let's talk about the conclusions. Just like with the previous videos, I think it's safe to say that both devices are fairly close, fairly comparable in their sound signature. The differences that are present are likely because the Mojo emphasizes the bass too much, and because the Mojo melds the frequencies too much, and because the Mojo, when you increase the volume, it adds a bit of graininess, and that it just begins to slightly distort the frequency a little bit the more power you try to eke out of it. Whereas the iFi doesn't present that. One of the things that stood out to me is just the slight airy difference between the iFi and the Mojo in the last song that we tested, which was Why Am I Like This by Orla Gartland. And that slight difference is of some significance to those who want to hear a little bit of air in the mids, but also don't really like the grainy sound signature that sometimes comes with players. The strange thing is that the way that the Mojo presented it is like the way I've heard it on cheaper DACs, cheaper digital audio players. Now, everybody's had a cheap digital audio player, I bet. And when you listen to a song and you increase the volume, you get kind of this distortion, this graininess, this harshness to the song that you didn't hear before, and it's kind of odd. That's almost like what the Mojo does, where it starts adding a little bit of harshness to the song, and it doesn't make sense. Like, why would it do that? When you switch to the iFi, it it didn't add distortion, it didn't add harshness, it just added the air. And so my conclusion is that the air is the difference, that the iFi adds the air and it sounds like air, and the Mojo, or it doesn't add the air, it's just presenting it, and the Mojo takes that air and says, I don't know what this thing is, I'm just going to add distortion. I don't know what it's doing. It's simply not presenting the song the same way as the iFi in that one little example. Overall, I think that when you're choosing between these two, it really comes down to functionality. Which one do you prefer? If you prefer the size, you want a smaller size, then the Mojo. If you prefer a slightly more open, slightly more airy presentation, then the iFi. If you prefer the extra features of the iFi with the filters, multiple filters, then yeah, the iFi. If you prefer the hassle, the frustration, and the additional cost, then the Mojo. Okay, I hope that this has been of some help to you. Thank you so much for watching, for listening. If you have any comments or suggestions, please leave them in the comment section below. I'm on Patreon, and I would truly appreciate it if any of you would consider donating to me once a month on Patreon. I currently have 4 fabulous patrons who have decided to give me their hard-earned money once a month, and I truly appreciate that they have done so, that they've decided to do that. If any of you find my content entertaining or informative, then perhaps you might consider donating to me a couple of bucks a month. It would truly help me out to keep this channel going. Finally, if you have requests for reviews of the equipment that I currently own, then please review the review request form. Review the review request form? Go to the review request form. Fill that out, submit it. I'll take a look at it. I'll put it all in a giant list that you can take a look at and see where your request is. And I will get to your request as soon as I possibly can. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for participating. I hope everyone has a fantastic Wednesday. It's Wednesday. Hey, have a fantastic Wednesday. And I wish you a wonderful rest of the week. Take care.